This video is going to cover option 1, the main snare solo. It's number 4 out of the book Portraits in Rhythm by Anthony Cirone, and I just wanted to make a couple comments about this book. I have the study guide version by the composer. He offers several comments on each solo, and I highly recommend purchasing this book if you haven't already. Another one of his books has solos 1 through 50 all in one book with no study guide narrative, and you may have that book. But I would recommend purchasing the other one because he gives a lot of comments that I'm not going to be able to cover in this video. For me, in this book, number 4, which is the main snare solo for this year, is on page 15. So my page numbers are a little different than what is listed on the Missouri Bandmasters website. Good comments. A lot of them I'm not going to be able to cover, so I highly recommend purchasing the book as you work on this solo. Let me first address some of the technical issues in this solo. There are many grace notes, including roughs, 4 strokes, and 5-stroke drags. So I want to talk a little bit about how to play those. In measure 1, there's your first 4-stroke rough. This one I would play a little bit more open, so I would do an alternating sticking because it gives it more of that grandioso feel. I like to start it with my left, so I end on my right, but it doesn't matter. As long as all of them are alternating, you should be okay. The next set of grace notes happens at the end of line 3, and they're just simple roughs, but you want to make sure you're playing concert-style roughs, so they're much closer together than if you were playing a rudimental outdoor-sounding rough. So they need to sound pretty tight, kind of like this. I'm definitely not buzzing them. I am giving 2 strokes to that rough, but they're still just a little bit scrunched together than they were before. The next 4-stroke rough is at the beginning of line 7, and it's very, very quiet. You have plenty of time to prepare to play this 4-stroke, so the sticking doesn't matter because of the tempo, but that dynamic level is really important. I would recommend playing a double left in the middle there. So my sticking is going to be right, left, left, and then ending on my right. Again, I'm going to scrunch it together a little bit so it's a little bit more closed, primarily because of the soft dynamic level. The last set of tricky grace notes are in line 10, where you have those 5 strokes. Now these are played as double strokes, so you're going to go right, right, left, left, right, but squish them together one more time. That's really the theme of these grace notes. They need to sound closed, and that does not mean buzzed. That just means closer together. So when I use the words open and closed in this concert style setting, open just means a little bit more space, whereas closed means we're going to push them together a little bit. Both those 5s are played with the double strokes, as I mentioned earlier. They're just going to be squished together. One of the other tricky things in this solo is the roll notation. They're all buzz rolls, concert style, multiple bounce rolls, but they look different, and I wanted to explain why. The first roll you see in the first bar has 3 slashes, pretty common for buzz roll notation. In fact, the rolls you see in the first 3 lines all look the same because they all have a long duration. When it starts to look different is the roll in line 10. All of a sudden we only have 2 slashes there, but that does not mean you move to a double stroke roll, even though that's kind of our mentality. It's still a buzz roll, they just don't have enough room to print a 3rd slash since it's an 8th note roll. So those are still buzz rolls there. In the last measure, it gets even more confusing because you have 2 slashes and 3 slashes in the same roll. It's still just a concert buzz roll. There's just not enough room to print that 3rd slash when the roll is literally on a 16th note. So even though the notation looks different, every roll in this solo is a concert buzz style roll. When you're playing a multiple bounce roll, you always want to know what the skeleton rhythm is underneath your buzz. This helps you start and end right when you're supposed to. The skeleton, or what we call roll bass, helps you start and stop the roll in the exact rhythm that you're supposed to. You can either do a roll bass in a triplet pattern or a duple pattern. So you can have 3 strokes per 8th or 16th or 2 strokes per 8th or 16th. It is really dependent on the tempo. If you have a really fast tempo, your roll bass probably will be fewer strokes. If you have a slower tempo, you are able to fit in more strokes per quarter note. In this piece, our tempo is 58. In the dotted quarter rolls, I think you're able to put triplet roll basses underneath. So in that first roll, I would play this as my skeleton. Now if I buzz that, it sounds like this. That is a triplet roll bass. Throughout the first 3 lines, I'm going to do all a triplet roll bass. As I get down to line 10, where my next rolls are, those are pretty quick. I don't have quite as much time, so I think I'm going to actually do a 4 underneath those. It's really just a buzzed 5-stroke. Because they're short and loud, I can get in that many strokes. And then the last roll, I'm going to start a little faster and get a little slower because I'm going with a decrescendo. The musical issues in this solo really center around phrasing. Phrasing is kind of a fancy word used at sometimes that many people don't explain very well. One of the most common things I tell my students regarding phrasing is play the beaming. Let me explain what that means. If you look in the second measure of line 4, you can see that there are only 2 beams in that bar. All the notes underneath are connected to just 2 beams. So my recommendation, in order to show that you know there are only 2 beams in that bar, is that you put a slight agogic accent at the beginning of each of those beamings. That's what I mean when I say play the beaming. It really shows a musical maturity that you understand a little bit of the concepts regarding phrasing. Now you want to make sure that your agogic accent is more of an implied accent. It's not a printed accent, and I'm going to demonstrate the difference here. Here's what I would call a printed accent in the dynamic. Printed accents usually go 1 dynamic higher than the dynamic you're currently playing. So here's what I would call a printed accent. Now that's not quite what I want. An agogic accent, an implied accent, really is a lot lighter than that, but it is still audible. You still should be able to hear kind of a nice lilt to this phrase. Here's an example of an agogic accent. It's not super loud, but it's more subtle. You want to be careful in this bar that you don't accent the flam. Just because it's a flam does not mean it's accented. The last thing I'd like to address in this solo are the dynamics, particularly the extreme dynamics at the end of the piece. You'll notice in line 11 it begins with 3 Fs followed by 3 Ps with cap accents on the 3 Fs. Those are pretty extreme dynamics, and they're going to take some preparation in order to play them correctly. What you don't want to do is play your fortissimo and decrescendo to the 3 Ps. You want to make sure it is immediate from 1/16th note to the next. So you need to prepare that triple P. What I recommend is the last 2 cap accents of beat 1 in that first measure of line 11, you're going to leave down after you've played them. So you're playing your accents really high, but the last 2 leave down, so you are preparing the pianissimo. You need to do the opposite as you're going into the loud. If I'm at the end of my pianissimo, the last 2 notes I'm going to raise so that I am prepared to play those next 3 Fs with those cap accents. Whenever that happens, you need to prepare the dynamic beforehand, or you're going to get a decrescendo and a crescendo, which is clearly not written. This will take some practice. Let me demonstrate it slow so you can understand what I'm talking about. You You have time on that last one because you have an eighth note there. But the ones before clearly are 16th notes apart, and they're going to take some preparation. Here's what it looks like up to tempo.